Well, good deal. We're excited to be here with you today. Rob and I were actually just joking. You guys are the true dedicated ones because this is during lunch hour, right? So you must really want to be here to learn about how CrowdStrike sees the threat landscape today in terms of the cloud threat landscape. Anyways, thanks again for being here. Like I mentioned, I am Brett Shaw. I'm on our product marketing group here at CrowdStrike, educating customers in the market about the latest of what's going on here in the cloud threat landscape, and specifically I cover our cloud security solutions.
And I'm Rob Solomon, Solutions Architect at CrowdStrike, helping customers and partners on their security journey at AWS.
Awesome. And so let's go ahead and get right into it. As you saw there, and as I mentioned, we actually just released our cloud risk report last week. This is a report that surrounds findings and insights around what we're seeing in the cloud threat landscape. We track hundreds and hundreds of adversaries. We have thousands and thousands of customers, and the insights that make up this report actually come from that, right? Is our intel teams, our threat hunting teams, our platform telemetry. And we're getting all this valuable insight to really understand how the adversary works and to be able to help you and the market understand, okay, how are cloud adversaries, or even adversaries in general, but specific today, how are cloud adversaries targeting organizations today? What are their motives? What are their agenda? And that's what we're breaking down today as well. And we'll go through those real world stories, and Rob will actually give us a great breakdown as we go through this for best practices about defending against these cloud security events. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into it. We have two reports. These stats here come from our global threat report. Now I don't want to confuse you too much, but this is a good idea into what we're seeing in terms of overall threat landscape. This first stat here is the breakout time is 84 minutes. It's reduced down to 84 minutes, and this is very important to understand because what that means is it only takes an adversary about 84 minutes from them initially compromising a host to move laterally within the account. As you know this, they're getting smarter, they're getting faster, they're getting more sophisticated to move within the victim environment. From there, we've seen a huge increase in cloud access broker activity. That's the middle number here that we're looking at, 112% increase in cloud access broker activity. These adversaries specialize in harvesting credentials, and then they're selling them to the highest bidder. And so someone with a few $100s, few $1,000s can purchase these credentials and have the keys to the kingdom to organizations across the globe. And finally, the majority of what we're going to be talking about today is the increase in cloud exploitation. And we're obviously at AWS here. Y'all are building on AWS and growing with AWS, and adversaries know that. They know that organizations are moving to the cloud, and we've seen just this last 12 months a 95% increase in cloud exploitation. And not only that, we've seen an almost 3x increase in cloud conscious adversaries. That is, these adversaries that use cloud-specific features and different tools and specifically target and go after cloud environments. Like I mentioned before, we track over 200 adversaries, and we're seeing many of these become very cloud conscious. Again, focusing on using cloud-specific features to target organizations and cloud environments. We just highlight a few here. Here's some prominent ones that we've seen here. But again, it's just something that we're seeing in the rise in the cloud threat landscape. So moving on, these actually come from the Cloud Risk Report. And this is available to download as well. And you can take this back to your teams and read further on this. But we're going to highlight these. And what we're really noticing from these cloud conscious adversaries is they're sharpening their cloud TTPs. This first one that I want to call out is that 43% of cloud-based intrusions, we saw that valid accounts were used for initial access. Again, they're targeting these accounts, they're getting access into the accounts, and then they're breaking in and they're just opening the front doors and getting in through these valid accounts. Secondly is that we see privilege escalation within IAM roles. That these 67% of the time that we saw an incident, IAM roles were elevated beyond the privilege that was actually required for that specific role. And this could indicate that an adversary subverted the role to move laterally within the account. And finally, they're covering their tracks. They don't want to be found. They want to hide in there. They want to understand as much as they can about the environment. 28% of cloud-based intrusions that we observed, the adversaries deleted an instance 28% of the time. Again, they're covering their tracks and hiding to really avoid any type of detection and any type of remediation response. So next is this human error, and it's obviously we are humans, we make mistakes. There's cloud provider settings that we've found that by default aren't secure, and so what we saw as we go through this is 60% of containers actually lack properly configured security settings. And from there, 47% of these detected misconfigurations that we have involve some sort of ineffective identity and entitlement management. Again, going after those roles and those identities to access and target and break into the cloud environment. And finally, a third of the incidents that we saw, they had insecure cloud provider settings. And so I'm going to kind of take a break there. So Rob, what do we find? Like, how can organizations best protect against these types of threats, or as they're, building in the cloud and scaling? This is obviously a problem. So how can they best, deal with that?
Yeah, something that we talk about a lot is the skills gap. That it's hard to find and hire qualified folks with the security skill set, the cloud operations skill set, and combined the cloud security skill set. And the rate of innovation in AWS is well known. So new people coming in and working in the cloud don't necessarily know those security best practices and how to configure the services in a secure way. So, getting help with a cloud security posture management solution is really important because that provides that guidance in, how to secure your services. As you say, most of these are self-inflicted. We're talking about misconfiguration. The other challenge that people have is cloud operates at such large scale and resources are constantly being, deployed and torn down. Being able to automate that deployment, to make it easy, to make it automatic, so that there does not require any additional human intervention to stay protected. Those two things are really important.
Good. Thanks, Rob. So let's go ahead and get into it. I absolutely love this next part. I love understanding the way that an adversary, targets. I don't love that they actually, compromise the thing. Let me step back a little. I just like to understand how they're actually moving and their motives and how they're working today. And so this first one we're looking at, they deploy a sliver implant and target cloud credentials. And it all started with the initial access, and they actually achieved remote code execution on multiple Linux hosts via a vulnerable PHP application. Again, they're getting in there, they're establishing that connection and gaining access. And they want to get around. They want to understand, okay, what's going on? What type of environment am I in? And they're using different commands and obtaining IP address information from an external domain. And not only that, they're querying the AWS IMDS API to enumerate IAM roles. And from there, they're establishing persistence. They created a cron job, which is a time-based job scheduler, to actually download and run that sliver implant upon reboot. And again, they're establishing that persistence. They want to stay in that environment as long as they can. And then they used that same AWS IMDS API to actually harvest these different cloud credentials so they could move laterally within the account. And finally, on the C2 side, they use curl, which is used for making API requests and downloading files over HTTP, and they use that for that same sliver implant to use it and establish that persistence and maintain control over the environment. And so as we look at this, Rob, what are some of the best practices that organizations can go through to defend against these types of attacks?
Yes, so we talk about sophisticated attacks, that the adversaries today are cloud conscious. They know what their, the objective of their attack, whether it is data exfiltration or operational disruption or whatever that is. So these attacks are interactive. They start with initial access, and while they go, they're always performing that discovery to see what resources are available to them on the target system. So they pivot. They see what opportunity they have, they take advantage of it, and if they come up against a security obstacle, they try something different in real time. So it really speaks to the importance of a defense in-depth approach. There's really no one layer that's going to take care of everything. That's really what we're talking about here. You've got to figure out what your attack surface is, what the likely threat is, your misconfigurations, your least privilege. So, let's sort of go through the list here. In this particular case, that initial access, where you were mentioning before, 47% of attacks are using valid credentials.
Yep.
Well, the rest of them are largely taking advantage of public-facing vulnerable systems. So this really speaks to the importance of patch management. It's not cloud-specific. This is something that everybody knows about. You've got to have a vulnerability management process in your organization. So that patching security vulnerabilities is critical and can't be overlooked. Deploying a web application firewall. You have these public-facing web applications that you can perform data validation. So if there's an attack launched against those applications and the adversary sending data that is subverting the expected function of that application, web application firewall can often block that attack right then and there. So that's a really important layer. Hardening images, practicing container immutability. We were seeing that after initial access, once the adversary has control over a compromised system, first thing they do is they use the built-in tools or available tools on the operating system to advance the attack, to figure out what their privilege level is and what tools exist that they can use to move laterally. So it's really important when you're building those gold images that are production-facing, whether it's a VM image for EC2, an AMI, or whether it is, whether it's a container image, to make sure that you're only including the components that are required to run that application, and everything else, whether you think adversaries are going to use it or not, you should really not include in those images. Sometimes adversaries are able to get around multiple layers. And at the end of the day, they're going to find themselves in a runtime environment on a workload. So it's really important that you have that line of defense. Strong runtime security will cover for a lot of weakness in other layers, and that's really where the rubber hits the road. So, having that XDR capability, being able to detect indicators of attack in real time on the compromised host can actually stop that compromise right then and there if you have an automated response capability. It's a critical layer. And just talking about misconfigurations, having an awareness of which of the more the more dangerous and high-risk misconfigurations. And so having a cloud security posture management capability that will prioritize those risks in your environment, those misconfigurations, so that you can go after those first. Now, IMDS v2 is something that we see a lot of that out there, and it is used for lateral movement. So it's really important to close that one up. And always least privilege. When we see these attacks moving laterally, they're taking advantage of credentials on the OS, to be able to exfiltrate data or credentials that are stored on the OS. So don't store hard-coded credentials in your production-facing systems. But as with IMDS, there's a role assigned to a system, whether it's a container or EC2 instance, that can be used to access other AWS services. So you want to have that least privilege so that even if something happens and an attacker gets a foothold in that system, they won't be able to use the credentials associated with that system to keep moving. So that least privilege applies to identity. And IAM gives you a lot of opportunities to create those granular policies. And network access as well. And we'll see that in the next example. So CrowdStrike provides multiple tools to help you with those specific risks. Falcon Cloud Workload Protection is our sensor-based runtime protection. It not only provides that telemetry stream and the additional visibility, gives you insight into the vulnerabilities in the OS and packages that are on the OS. In the case of containerized workloads, it can detect container drift. I mentioned before, hardened AMI images and immutable container images. When you create those container images, the best practice for containers is that if you need to make a change to that image, you build a new image from scratch if you need to patch it. You don't want to really interact with that image once it's been created. That's what's known as immutability. So sometimes we see, you mentioned before, 60% of container images that we see have misconfigurations. One of the ones there is that we see a lot of containers that once they're launched in a container environment, the first thing they do is they download a package from the internet and execute it. Is it malicious? Is it intentional? It really is not best practice because it's hard to know. And automating that deployment, again, to make sure that the sensor is deployed for all new sort of auto-scaled EC2 instances or automatically launched pods to make sure that they're all protected. Falcon Cloud Security Posture Management, that's the agentless protection. That is always scanning all of your AWS services for misconfigurations, providing actionable guidance that you can build back into your infrastructure as code templates. We also provide a capability for automated remediation as needed. In fact, we can detect unmanaged instances that don't have the sensor, and remediate that right from the CSPM console. And also, it enables you, our CSPM has cloud infrastructure entitlement management that will provide an analysis of whether you're using least privilege policies on your roles, and provide some guidance for pruning those privileges to only what you need. Falcon Spotlight is the component, again, that telemetry is pulled from that same sensor that we use for EDR. And that will show the vulnerabilities of all the packages, and then and we prioritize that, not just by CVE score, but also in the likelihood that it's going to be used in the attack. And finally, Falcon image scanning. So that is provides some of the Spotlight functionality, looking at the packages that have been deployed in your container image to see if they have any vulnerabilities, and also looking for misconfigurations like hard-coded secrets and creating container images that have too many Linux capabilities and privilege that would allow it to escape into the host. So image scanning will look at all of those potential points of risk and provide a vulnerability score that you can set a threshold that if the threshold for vulnerabilities is exceeded, the build job, the container build job will fail with a report of those vulnerabilities and kick back to your developers so that they can fix those vulnerabilities. If it succeeds, it can move on in your CI/CD pipeline toward being pushed to a repository, a OCI compliant registry, or deployed in your environments.
Yeah, thanks for running through that. And I've seen a lot of people taking pictures, but let's go ahead and jump into the next example in this real world example that we have. This is a highlight of Panda, who's a Chinese-based adversary that we track. They're looking at exploiting and moving across Linux and cloud workloads. And it begins with the C2 side, where they use that same tool, that same curl tool that I talked about before, to actually download this other tooling actually from a Chinese GitHub repository and establish that connection within the organization. From there, they use some defense evasion techniques, and which they use time stomping, which is a way that they can manipulate the timestamps of the different web shell files that they have. So again, really hindering any type of investigation efforts from the security teams, and really any response efforts that might go on if they're hiding there and not being able to be discovered. And then from there, again, they just want to learn as much as they can about the organization as they can. They're using different tools out there, again, to scan how they can best effectively move laterally within the account, right? Scanning local subnets, understanding more and more about the environment that they're in, harvesting and attempting to harvest these different cloud credentials to gain access and spread laterally through the environment. And they attempted this via SSH as well. And so we see this, and it's kind of a common theme that they want to establish that connection, understand as much as they can about the victim environment, do some defense evasion techniques, gather more credentials, target these cloud workloads, and move. And so we're seeing, Rob, organizations are, whether they start on-prem environment and move to cloud, right, or start on cloud and move to on-prem, we're seeing this. It's not, they want to just get access into the organization, right? And whether that, again, they start, on-prem or move to the cloud, it's important to know that they're not just targeting, they're moving where organizations are moving as well. So how do we protect against this type of lateral movement?
Yeah, the adversaries are not respecting our logical boundaries. Yeah. They're looking for the path of least resistance and using all the tools at their disposal. So, we do see a lot of, spear phishing, even targeting folks in DevOps or security to get their credentials, maybe getting onto their machines, their workstations, and from there moving laterally into the cloud environment because they have the credentials on the machine and the access. So. So what we see here is that, despite your best efforts at preventing an intrusion, it does happen. And when it does happen, it's really important that you detect that as quickly as possible so you can take remedial action. In some situations where CrowdStrike is called in to a non-CrowdStrike customer to do incident response, one of the first things our IR team will do is to deploy the Falcon sensor across the environment. Super simple. And that immediately provides that telemetry to show us what is actually going on in those systems. And very often we find that an adversary, one or more adversaries, has made themselves comfortable in that environment for potentially months or years. Sensor will then go and clean up those attacks. But but it does happen frequently. So creating that strong identity boundary with least privilege, again, there's no substitution. That is a very common vector for lateral movement.
Sorry about that. But shifting back there.
In this particular scenario, we're also seeing the adversary leveraging lateral movement across the network. So least privilege in the network configuration, network segmentation, micro-segmentation is really important. Once the adversary has compromised a particular host and uses built-in tools or is able to pull down new tools to do network scanning, you can block all that through network policies. Through micro-segmentation, this is something that is maybe easier to do in a containerized environment. You can actually set policies that only allow one microservice to talk to just the one or few microservices that they actually need access to over those ports. So you can really restrict the kind of lateral network access that is allowed in your environment, and doing that can really reduce the ability to perform discovery, or as we saw, move laterally by trying to initiate SSH sessions. Like, what are the chances that a production microservice is going to need to SSH into another production microservice within the same cluster? Almost nil. Again, hardening images, we see in this attack as well that once the adversary gets a foothold, first thing they try to do is use the native tools or download additional tools. So hardening those images is critical. Runtime security, there's been a lot of discussion about this, I think, over recent years about whether agentless security is enough, and I think what everybody's finding is that you need a combination. You need an integrated approach. And we saw in the last example defense evasion. So what is an attacker going to do? They're going to try to cover their tracks. They're going to disable logging. AWS services provide a wealth of telemetry. So attackers know that, and the first thing they're going to do is try to disable that. So misconfiguration, indicators of misconfiguration will show you providing least privilege that does not provide that privilege to, let's say, turn off bucket logging. It's really important to consider that as well. Cloud workload protection, detect and respond in real time. So that EDR functionality, again, that is an automated feature. Making sure that your deployment of the sensor is automated. Falcon Cloud Security Posture Management is really going to give you a lot of insight into your posture and give you guidance about where you should focus first. So, and it's not only looking at the indicators of misconfiguration, but it is also, it's also ingesting the API event stream from CloudTrail. So, if you're not familiar with CloudTrail, CloudTrail is an AWS service that is, that is tracking all of the control plane API activity, across your accounts. So we ingest that stream, and we're looking for behavioral anomalies that are correlated with sensor telemetry and really everything that we can see in your environment. All that data is correlated to see if any particular indicator of attack that we see is an actual attack in progress. And gives you guidance to tighten your network policies. Identity protection, so we see a lot of these attacks starting with valid credentials that have been stolen from an attack or phishing or what have you. So how do you know that the use of a valid credential in your environment is valid or malicious? There are patterns to the use of those credentials. Are you seeing a service account that is trying to initiate a remote desktop connection. Should never happen. Are you seeing authentication activity in off hours or from odd locations? Those sorts of anomalies, again, each individual hint or clue may not say, beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is an attack in progress. But if you take all these indicators together, even these identity-based attacks can be stopped in real time. And again, Falcon image scanning. You want to make sure that all of your container images, are not passing through vulnerabilities into your production environment.
Very good, very good. So let's get into this. Now we have a third example here, but again, it's not varying much from example to example here, Rob. We're seeing, they are gaining initial access, whether that's through, credentials like we've talked about, or a vulnerable public-facing web application, and establishing that connection, understanding what's going on throughout what type of environment it is. They want to understand everything they can about it, how they can move laterally within it. Are there, these credentials that are accessible by me, or can I go after them? And then finally moving laterally within the account. So again, this is just another one that we've observed. It's same types of TTPs that they're using. They're same story. And again, we're just noticing kind of this pattern with them, and obviously they're targeting organizations today. So that's what I wanted to highlight here. I don't know what more you want to say about best practices, but I know they take advantage and they don't make it easy for us to target or to discover them and find them out.
Yeah. When we get up on stage and talk to people, I think we really want to convey that the risk is real and that it's important for people to protect themselves.
Yep.
Cloud security does have some complexities. It does have some challenges, but it's not rocket science. There are established, attack sequences that the adversaries, maybe the specifics change, but the attack sequences are, essentially the same.
Yeah.
So, what response, what tools, what practices you use to protect against one attack is going to protect you against most attacks.
Yep.
The key here is don't make it easy for the adversary. Don't leave the door wide open. Practice least privilege. That's critical. Make sure you have good observability. Make sure you're discovering and covering those resources in an automated fashion. So it's not coming down to someone making sure that every time someone deploys a resource, they're checking that resource. That all has to be shifted left. It has to be done ahead of time, before the infrastructure goes into internet-facing production. So again, patching the security vulnerabilities. Most IT and operations teams have an established method for managing vulnerabilities and automating package deployment. But having the visibility into those vulnerabilities in one single pane of glass is really important. That web application firewall, super helpful for internet-facing web apps. If you don't have one in your environment, an application-aware firewall, this is a strong recommendation. Hardening images, by default, OSs are not, not secure necessarily, and some more than others. Mm-hmm. So, looking at them, making sure that you've turned off everything, that you've removed all packages that are not required for doing its job. Runtime security, critical. Should always have that. This IMDS keeps popping up. Whenever I look at consoles of what are the top the top misconfigurations, IMDS v1. I see that over and over again. Yep. Least privilege. Always important. Yeah.
Good deal.
So So what do we have that's different? Falcon Cloud Workload Protection. Well, something I'd like to say about Falcon Cloud Workload Protection. So, our sensor that is deployed on EC2 instances, we've really focused on making it super easy, because the harder it's going to be to deploy that, the more likely it's not going to get deployed. So, we just released the systems manager distributor package, and we have an automation doc. So it's really easy to create a policy so that automatically every time a new EC2 instance is launched through an auto-scaling group, or in a container environment, cluster autoscaler or Carpenter, anything like that. Every single time that EC2 instance is deployed, SSM, it'll trigger that automation, and the sensor will automatically be deployed, associated with your customer ID. So all of the data from your organization is correlated together. And in the container scenario, we let's say for EKS specifically, we deploy the host sensor as a daemon set. So you just really have to configure that once in your Kubernetes environment. Every new worker node gets a pod from the daemon set. It is a privileged pod that one pod is able to protect all of the pods on that node and the host as well. So again, we don't want customers to have to keep chasing or running to keep up. It's like you configure it once and you're protected. Next. Again, when you move to the cloud, one of the ideas is you want to encourage experimentation in your developer, your operations teams, your security teams. And that means that folks are going to be deploying resources that they may not have a lot of experience with. So they may not know what the best practices are. Providing that insight, that visibility into, okay, I've deployed this. Look, you want to go back and you want to lock down your network policies. You want to enable this or that. It's really important guidance to help people get up to speed to develop those skills.
Yep.
And even when you create those hardened images or the container images that might be secure when you build them, new vulnerabilities are discovered all the time. So you want to have that scanning happening in the background, and our sensor will provide that continuous visibility into the vulnerability of your packages. And CrowdStrike has a very active partner ecosystem. Any functionality that CrowdStrike doesn't necessarily have, we have partners who will fill that gap. So we have network detection and response partners, and their telemetry is integrated with the Falcon Extended Detection and Response (XDR). So that their indicators of attack are correlated with the Falcon telemetry to make detection assessments.
Cool. And Rob's highlighted this throughout the presentation today, but here you get a snapshot of our Falcon Cloud Security solution, right? He talked about having an agentless capability and functionality along with agent-based as well, and we provide that, right, with our Falcon Cloud Security, and he highlighted that, where we're monitoring for those misconfigurations, and even on the compliance side with different frameworks that we can measure against, like PCI, NIST, CIS, and the different frameworks as well, and moving to that runtime protection as well, and even shifting left and securing those hosts. And Rob's done a great job of identifying this and showing this throughout the presentation, and understanding those different identities as well. Rob, is there anything you want to highlight on this slide here?
Just to sort of point out the CIEM functionality.
Yeah.
And that helps you with your least privilege. It's not necessarily easy. It takes additional effort to identify what a good least privilege policy is. Keem will help you
Yeah.
do that. And the container image scanning, again, is part of Falcon Cloud Security and part of our shift left strategy.
Yeah. And not only that, the other thing I want to highlight too is, and you alluded to this, it's not enough just to have that agentless scanning, right? It's about having that unified platform across everything. And we do have that protection from endpoint to cloud. And we do this through our unified platform that you can see here. And we have thousands and thousands of customers that sit across all the industries across the entire globe. And all of this adversary activity that we're seeing, we're using that and pumping that into what we call our data fabric, where we correlate it in real time. And we have our intel team and our threat hunting team at the same time putting that into it. And that's how we remain so effective. And we're in a unique spot, again, to have that full coverage that we talked about today. And so to wrap up, Rob's definitely hit on these points, and so I'm not going to belabor it anymore, right? I'll just put these up here. We've got to prioritize cloud identity protection, gain visibility into any type of security gaps that you have, employ that real-time monitoring, and ensure timely patching. Definitely key takeaways today, key takeaways from the Cloud Risk Report and the findings that we had there as well. So with that said, you can actually, and there's droppers on your seat, you can actually understand, did you want to say something?
Nope.
Okay. You can actually understand your cloud risk. We've got a cloud security risk review that you can go back and try this out to gain that visibility into your cloud environment, see what risk is there, and really bring this value and visibility that you may be missing in minutes. And so with that said, Rob, is there any closing remarks that you'd like to say before we wrap up? Before I open it up to Q&A, and I'm sure you'll get some questions asked.
Yeah, I mean, just to say that we're excited about the AWS built-in launch. And
yeah,
we
little
are a
plug.
launch
He worked on
partner.
it. That's why he got a little plug on that.
Yeah, and again, in line with making it really easy to to deploy Falcon Cloud Security in your environment in an automated way. That is. That has the AWS well-architected seal of approval. We thought that was really important for our customers.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
check it out. It'll be available in the marketplace.
Yeah, it's available, and we have dozens and dozens of different integrations that Rob's actually built and worked on, and his team has worked on. So as you, just like you said, as you innovate with AWS and as you scale with AWS, CrowdStrike can be there to help secure the cloud and your workloads there. Well, again, thank you guys. Thank you all for your time. Appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your show. Thank you.
Thank you.